During the Roaring Twenties, the consumption and manufacturing of alcohol resulted in the creation of the 18th Amendment. While the 18th Amendment was in effect, it caused conflict regarding increased crime rates, Americans feeling as though they were stripped of their rights, and lack of tax revenue, which resulted in an economic decline. Due to the failure of Prohibition, the 21st Amendment was created to repeal the 18th as a compromise which allowed legal figures to focus more on important things, citizens to feel as though they had a voice in government, and it also lowered crime rates. The temperance era began in the 1820s and coincided with the Second Great Awakening, a Protestant religious movement which was followed by abolitionism, the early women's rights movement, and even the push for labor laws during the Industrial Revolution. All of these movements led to what is commonly referred to as the Progressive Era in America, roughly from 1890 to 1920. Temperance was key to many of these movements as it was rooted in religious ideals and sought to improve family relations, morals, and encourage a productive society. Women were at the forefront of the fight for prohibition because alcoholism was deeply affecting their families in ways they could not remedy. Divorce was extremely uncommon and custody of children typically went to the father because women did not often work outside the home and could not support a family alone. Even World War I had a profound effect on the climate of the country, leading to anti-German sentiment that was often used in prohibitionist propaganda. Although prohibition is generally perceived to be poorly received by the country, the fact of the matter is that the amendment had the time limit of 7 years for ratification, but the states reached the necessary majority in only 11 months. Many states had hardly had statewide prohibition in place, some for decades. When the amendment went into effect, the majority of America voted for prohibition, believing they were voting for a betterment of the country.
Following the First Industrial World War, life as people knew was changed drastically. It tore down old cultures and gave counterculture the chance to begin again. After the war ended, the youth of the nations that fought became known as the Lost Generation, having drafted some of the best and brightest to die in charges against machine gun nests. But the stage was set for a global counterculture to spread new ideas of peace, art, and inequality on the ruins of the old world. With the end of the war came the Roaring Twenties. The decade was an era of political and social change. The 1920s roared with a clash of civilizations as Americans struggled to reconcile the prosperous modernity of the city with the impoverished traditionalism of the country. During the decade, America became the wealthiest country of the world. Certainly a time for celebration, the rise of flapper girls, jazz music, and women's rights ignited in America. Along with the risky nightlife and partying came with drinking. Women all across the nation felt empowered with their newly granted right to vote, whether it be sexually
or advancements in society. There are several ways in which historical context mattered to the success of the Prohibition movement. First, immigration was increasing dramatically after the Civil War and even more so between 1880 and 1920, and many temperance advocates associated various immigrant groups with drinking and the things they assumed it was also linked to, like political corruption, urban disorder, and family dysfunction. So, to some extent, the fight for prohibition was a fight by native-born, mostly white Americans who wanted to control immigrants. Secondly, during the second half of the 19th century, women were staking out a larger role in public reforms, and the largest of the temperance organizations was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Thirdly was the growing power of local, state, and federal governments in the years following the Civil War, which made something like prohibition possible, a quite intrusive use of the state to control the people's power. The reaction to prohibition also had to do with historical context. In particular, many immigrant groups were quite aware that criminalizing alcohol was an attack on them and their communities, and they mobilized against it in a way infusing the Democratic Party, especially with the new momentum that accumulated in the 1932 presidential election. Economic change and urbanization led to crime and unemployment in major cities such as New York City. Many government officials and temperance movements at the time blamed this on alcoholism and adult drunkenness. An example of a prohibition movement is the anti-saloon movement. The League was a nonpartisan organization that focused on the single issue of prohibition. The League had branches across the United States to work with churches in marshaling resources for the prohibition fight. Another example is the women's temperance movement, which caused the creation of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. During the 1920s, with the right for women to vote, it sparked a confidence in women, making them feel as though they should speak up in society. Women of this time believed if America was dry, it could prosper in ways like never before. The reform was introduced at the same time that President Woodrow Wilson was advocating a moralistic foreign policy. The American architects of Prohibition attempted to export Prohibition abroad, forming in 1919 a World League Against Alcoholism. By attempting to make other countries abandon alcohol, the Prohibitionists wished to safeguard the U.S. against illegal imports of liquor and also displayed the moral idealism of the Prohibitionists, showing how their plans enmeshed with Wilsonian ideas for a new world order. The study of Prohibition as a movement can be used to illuminate the missionizing theme in American foreign policy at the time of World War I. The 18th Amendment, also known as the Prohibition Act, came into effect on January 17, 1920 in the United States, and it prohibited the selling and manufacturing of alcoholic beverages. With the passing of the 18th Amendment, conflict erupted in major cities across the United States. There were two sides in regard to the passing of the 18th Amendment. One side was the people who were pro-alcohol and therefore did not want prohibition. These people included gangsters, bootleggers, alcohol consumers, and speakeasies, as well as the Harlem Cotton Club. The Harlem Cotton Club was primarily a group of African Americans who went against the prohibition and still partied, participating in the increase of consumption of alcohol and sexual activity during the Harlem Renaissance. In no way, shape, or form did the alcohol prohibition make America dry. Americans went from drinking secretly at saloons to drinking secretly at their homes. In fact, consumption levels rose from 60 to 70% from pre-prohibition levels. The opposing side was against alcohol, who were pro-prohibition. These people included the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Anti-Saloon League, church groups, who were also supposed to be the authority. The authority did a poor job enforcing prohibition and often took part in the consumption of alcohol themselves. Without enforcement, nothing lasts. The actual supporters of the prohibition thought this law would impact Americans differently. They strongly believed that the money not being spent on alcoholic beverages would be put into savings accounts for useful appliances, life insurance, and improvements in education. Gangsters were very prominent during the Prohibition era and caused much violence and conflict. One of the most famous gangsters of the Prohibition era is Al Capone. He illegally made $105 million per year, which is equivalent to $1.4 billion today, on alcohol during the Prohibition era. He was the most wanted criminal in America. Capone was responsible for many brutal attacks of violence, mainly against other gangsters. The most famous of these attacks was St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, in which he ordered the assassination of 7 rival gang members. Capone was finally brought to justice for income tax evasion in 1931. After serving 6.5 years in prison, Capone was released and died in 1947 in Miami. After the government realized prohibition was failing from failed enforcement attempts, increased crime rates, and economic downfall from non-existent tax revenue that alcohol used to have, the 18th Amendment was replaced with the 21st Amendment on December 5, 1933. The 21st Amendment was the first amendment to repeal a previous amendment in history. The failure of the 18th Amendment and the Prohibition Act had effects that lingered in years following. Despite the Prohibition Act's failure, it still had the impact of the increase of violence, the use of other drugs, consumption levels returning back to pre-prohibition levels, and the crashing of the economy, which led to the Great Depression. Prohibition has had a big impact on drug policy today. Making alcohol consumption illegal did not stop crime or consumption during the Prohibition era. It only caused conflict and escalated chaos in society. Even until today, there is an ongoing debate on whether or not to legalize certain drugs. This controversial topic is disputed in today's government because clearly making drugs illegal is not working due to the black market and multiple drug cartels. In an interview with Professor Montree from Ohio State, she spoke on behalf of the relation between the Prohibition era and the legalization of marijuana in today's society. She said much of support for the legalization of marijuana was also a recognition of how counterproductive and expensive it is to make the drug illegal. Legalizing it frees police to concentrate on other problems and crimes, takes a burden off the court system, and relieves it from some of the stress on the prison system. That's similar to what people realized in the 1920s about the failure of prohibition of alcohol.